Welcome to Reading the Room, a literary podcast featuring author interviews and discussions with bookish content creators. I am your host, Jalen, also known as The Bar and the Bookcase on YouTube. Today I am so excited to be joined by Matthew Binder, author of Pure Cosmos Club, available now from Stalking Horse Press. This was a novel I came across when I found a list of new books coming out in May, and the cover of this book instantly caught my eye and I had to look into it. Pure Cosmos Club is a biting satire in which Matthew Binder takes surreal aim at the poses and pretensions of high art and fashion. With ruthless wit, Binder chronicles the struggles of Paul, an eccentric artist, and his companion dog, a disabled, quiche-obsessed terrier mix named Blanche. Together they negotiate hilarious scenes of bad parties, bizarre couture, deranged friends, shady deals, unrequited love, sabotage, and inscrutable art. But there may be a way out for Paul when he meets James, a new age guru and leader of a secretive cult, the Pure Cosmos Club. Yet, every time Paul believes he's ready for the ultimate level, James raises the price of entry. Just how far will Paul go for love, for art, and to attain cosmic oneness? This book was a blast from start to finish. It is full of short chapters with slapstick comedy and some really interesting and smart ideas about art and fashion and philosophy that really just blew me away. Matthew is also just a blast to talk with, and I think our conversation serves as a perfect introduction to what Matthew is trying to do with this absurdist tale, as it does feature one of my favorite fictional characters in recent memory, the dog Blanche. I mean, it's worth the price of entry alone just to meet Blanche, but I will leave the rest as a surprise. If you would like to support Reading the Room, a great way to do so is leaving a 5-star review wherever you get your podcasts, or joining my Patreon at patreon.com/readingtheroom. Otherwise, sharing these episodes with friends and family is another great way of getting the word out about the podcast. Thank you all so much for listening, and here is my conversation with Matthew Binder. Matthew, thank you so much for joining me today.
Hey, thank you. Thanks for having me here.
So we're here to talk about your new novel, Pure Cosmos Club, and I love it for so many reasons, and I've been trying to figure out where I want to start because there are many small chapters of absurdity in this book that there's many places to begin. But I want to just ask you, like, where did this novel come from, and what's like the story of its creation?
So had moved to New York in like late 2017, and I'm from New Mexico, and had never really spent much time in New York, but like thought I would like try it. I had actually moved to Budapest to write a different book. My last book called The Absolved. I like quit my job, moved to moved to Budapest, lived there for like a year. And then when I ran out of money, I came back to, I like searched around for a job, got a job in New York. I was like, great. And then I ended up I started dating this woman who was like very high up in like luxury fashion. She was like the director at this brand called The Row. And so that was sort of my like introduction to like high fashion. And so I was sort of surrounded by all these people, and then started meeting like all these like people in the art world through sort of through this community and through these circles, and was sort of had my first like introduction to like big money, like, you know, in New Mexico, like whatever, there's just not the kind of money that there is in New York. And so it was just like I was just in awe, and just not sort of in awe, sort of disgusted, but just surprised by the way like some people live in this world. And you know, I never experienced that before, but I just thought it was so interesting. And then so whatever, I had like a job like in tech, and then I got fired from that job, and I was like, well, I should do something with my time while I'm looking for a new job. And so I started Pure Cosmos Club, and it was like I had no like intentions of writing the book really. Like I got fired like on a Friday, and then I took off to El Salvador like on the following Monday. I was there for a week, and then I got back and I was like, well, I have this time, I should write a book. And I had like no idea what the hell the book was going to be. I just knew that I had gone to like this party and saw this little dog, this like big art dealer in New York named Michael Bargo, who's this really sweet guy, has this little dog named Timo, and it's like in a wheelchair. And I had been to like some parties at his apartment, and a lot of times I would just end up like hanging out with the dog because I was just like totally out of my element in this world with these like fancy art people. And so yeah, my thing was I guess my original idea was just to build this idea or this relationship between this strange man and his dog, like at least on day one. That's what the idea was.
That's interesting because so you're now the third author in a row that I've spoken to who has a story about their novel relating to tech in some way. So like
Mhm.
I don't know. It's just been interesting thinking about this question, and I didn't intend for this to be like numerous authors who kind of have this like a similar kind of story where their novels kind of have that inspiration, drawing from tech. But I'm wondering, for you and crafting Paul and Blanche, and the way that you create a character out of Blanche is like kind of the first glimpse or one of the first glimpses of absurdity in this book, and I'm just wondering how I know the back of this novel, it's billed as a satire, but I've heard you in other interviews say that you don't really see it as a satire. So I'm just wondering kind of how you view like the tone and style of this book.
Yeah, I mean, I guess what I was like ultimately trying to do is I was taking a character who's basically operates under like this very unique and different ethical framework, and then sort of see what that's like when he bumps up against like the real world. He sort of like just like a really radically subjective worldview from this narrator. And like a lot of people when they read it, I didn't know if people were going to get it at all. Like when I wrote the book, I was like, I it makes sense to me. Like his, Paul, the narrator's mind is very chaotic and vastly different than the way other people's brains work. But there's an internal consistency to like the way he thinks. And so, there's the world around him, and he's got his way of seeing things, but everyone else is sort of operating on this different wavelength. And I didn't know if people would get it. Turns out people are getting it, so that's really nice. I'm getting like responses all the time about this is the funniest book I've read in forever, and this is so unique and great. And I think probably takes people like a couple chapters to like get into the flow of it. Maybe like I had one person just tell me I read it a second time, and like understanding Paul's worldview from the beginning like changed the book for me. Like reading it, yeah.
We get Paul's perspective, and it does take a little bit of time, I guess, to kind of figure out what's going on there. But I will say that it is still like very consumable, like in the best way. Like it's the prose is very like direct, and so when the absurdity kind of comes, it I guess it lends itself to humor, I guess is what I'm trying to say. Like I just
Yeah.
really liked how you kind of create that world and that space of him. But like there's a couple of quotes like throughout the book that I thought were really interesting that kind of speak to others' perceptions of Paul or kind of how his limited framework might be perceived by others, like whether his sense of reality, like what is it real or is it just him, I guess. But
Yeah.
there's one where I forget who was saying this, but it's in his 20 years of doing this work, he says he's never encountered anyone with such a puzzling perception of what is true, which I really enjoyed that because
Mhm.
we meet who's one of my favorite characters like in recent fiction. I told you this already, but Blanche is just like I love dogs generally. I have a Boston Terrier
Yeah.
now. And so I guess my next question is about Blanche and how you went about kind of the outer boundaries of like what you wanted to do with making them kind of a person,
Yeah. Yeah.
and how that kind of worked for you.
Yeah, I mean, right. So what Paul's essentially doing is anthropomorphizing. I don't know if I said that right. Blanche, to Paul, Blanche is a friend, a confidant, a partner. He trusts Blanche's instincts more than he trusts his own. Like constantly, he's deferring to what he thinks are like Blanche's wishes or like Blanche's ideas. He has much more faith in her than he does in himself. But to other people in the book, she's just a dog, right? And so, in a couple of points of the book, like I have Blanche, Paul attributes things that Blanche are doing. He says things attributing things that she's done or she's doing in the book that yeah, you're getting it through Paul's eyes. And so it's very, it's like a very like Don Quixote type of thing where it's like as the reader you're going, well, that's probably not what's really happening in the world. That's just what's happening in Paul's mind. Or is it, right? Like, but yeah, so for me it was just like sort of like minding that line of like she could do almost anything in Paul's eyes, but it has to be I have to set up boundaries that like where other people are just seeing her as a dog, it's like uh and so he can like be um thinking that it's one thing and everyone else is just that's just a dog being a dog.
Yeah, and in terms of that and his kind of his the way he sees the world makes him maybe, ripe for being subject to a cult, which he is later in the novel. And so when did Pure Cosmos Club and the cult and James and all of that kind of factor in to the plot here?
Yeah, I mean, I guess one of the interesting characters in my life that I like met uh in living in New York was this guy who had started a bunch of businesses and like had some success and whatever, but his like best friend that he like grew up with had like taken this company public and became like a billionaire. So that was like his idea of success. And at some point he started like a meditation group, like doing like these large meditations. And eventually he grew the company to where he was doing like mass meditations at places like Madison Square Garden and then before COVID, like he got tapped by Oprah to like go on tour with Oprah, like leading these mass meditations, to, like open her, traveling shows. I was friendly with the guy, and like I don't think he's like a charlatan at all, like whatever. But I saw the way like people like responded to him as like this guru, and he just sort of. I was just seeing the way people like had this. He had this gravitational pull like the sun, and for myself, like I am not really a believer, but I really desperately want to be like, I really want to be touched by like the religious impulse. And I definitely like one of the major themes in the book is about like, I see like in contemporary society, especially a place like New York, where like anything that's like religious or based in tradition, anything that can basically provide someone some like bearings in their life is sort of seen as like anathema or retrograde and like against like progress. And so like I just see people are just like constantly like looking for something to like attach themselves to. So so many people I know have like joined some sort of group, and it might not be like labeled like a religion or a cult, but it has like religious or like cult like aspects. So it could be anything from Soul Cycle to like my friend Kath was telling me about. She was like in this like boxing club cult, and people are really searching for something because like with the loss of like traditional religion, like we're a little bit like rootless, I guess. And I sort of felt that myself. So part of this was like exploring that, like being someone who is really wants to feel the religious impulse but has not felt it. And I don't really feel myself susceptible to like anything. I'm like, pretty skeptical of everything, like politics, everything. Like I don't subscribe to anything. Like I'm very like skeptical of everything. But I really wish I wasn't. Like I really wish I could like let someone else take the wheel and steer a little bit.
This is something that I love thinking about because I myself, like in starting this book venture, have like, kind of self-reflected on like, what am I doing? Like, why am
Yeah.
I asking authors to come on and talk to me and then record it and post it on the internet? Or like, why do I see you mentioned Soul Cycle? Like, I love spin classes. That's been like my
Yeah.
like my newest thing that I'm just like fully addicted to. Like, why am I really enjoying that? Like, what am I seeking from that? And I myself am also not a particularly religious person, but I think art in general is maybe one way that creatives like yourself, like I guess my question for you is, do you see writing and creating fiction as one way that you kind of have as close to a religious experience as possible, or do you not see it that way?
I don't know if I see it as like a religious experience. I do see it as like a way of like making a mark on the world. Like someone asked me about like immortality, or they asked me a question about like writing the book, and I ended up like landing on the idea of like I don't know, like there's only like for normal people, there's only a couple different ways to like to have to leave a mark on the world, and like one of them is like make a lot of money and like own things that get passed down. Well, I'm not making a lot of money. Have kids that would be like your legacy, and like to date, I'm like fatherless, and so yeah, like I guess like making cool art was like the last option open available to me. So I think I am aware of that a little bit when I'm making things like like I know that my books are probably the best version of myself. Like it's the best work I can do. Like I'm not great at like speaking off the cuff like right now, or and I'm not great at like other things, but like I feel like I'm pretty good at writing these books. And so I'm kind of I'm aware of the stakes when I'm writing them. Like it's important to me.
Yeah, I mean, well, I agree with that. I think you're very good at writing, clearly. And I've been so curious to like meet you and talk to you about this book because if you can maybe already tell, I'm finding it hard to. I'm trying to like emulate or trying to pin down exactly what you're doing in this book, and I feel like it's so smart and digestible, but it's also like kind of hard to explain how it works
Yeah.
outside of reading it. You know what I mean? I mean that in the best way
Yeah.
possible. Like, and
Well,
I
if you
mean.
figure out how to talk about it, tell me so I can. I struggle with it too. Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I hope I can still, at least sell like the experience of reading it because I think it's so. I've never really had an experience of reading a book like this. Like I told you this before as well, but I tend to, or I realize that I read a lot of like contemporary kind of like realist fiction, I would say,
Yeah.
and so this book sort of challenged me in a sense because like I know Clancy Martin in the blurb in the back says you're our American Murakami, and Murakami I've read After Dark by him, but that was like it. And I mean, I
Yeah.
have read some like satire, some absurdist leaning books, but it is interesting because I love like thinking about why I'm drawn to fiction in particular and the novel as a form and what
Yeah.
kind of like why are there certain like strictures or rules or like if writers feel like they have to represent something real in their fiction, does it necessarily have to be something that kind of sticks to a coherent version of reality, or can you kind of just like let shit go and just like do whatever you want? So I don't know if you have something to say
Yeah.
about that, but
Yeah. No, I mean, whatever book you're writing, you basically have to lay out like a set of like criteria for the book, like the universe that you're operating in, that your book is operating in. And it can be different than, the physical world that we're moving through. Um, but the book has to be like it has to like adhere to those rules. So you can make it, that's what like fantasy, what fantasy is. It's like it's a totally different world, but it still adheres to like these rules, and like you can't break those rules. And so when a reader is reading a book and it breaks its own rules, you're taken out of the story. You go, yeah, that's bullshit. That's like whatever, like a Deus Ex Machina thing. Where, and so with Paul, like basically, like I just needed to like define a set of rules about like how his mind works, and just make sure to adhere to those rules. And those rules are different than like the normal people we operate that we live around, or maybe some people know people like Paul. But as long as he adheres to those rules, it's like it's I guess it's like not realist in the sense that it's how you live in your daily life, but it's realist in the terms of like those rules in the world that he's in. You know?
yeah, yeah, absolutely. I mean, one book that just comes to mind when you're explaining this. Have you read Motherhood by Sheila Heti?
No, but I want to. You know?
It's one of my favorite books, but she does something that I think is so clever that I always think about when I have these sort of conversations. Like she uses this method called like the I Ching method. So she flips a coin and it says yes or no. And so she asks it questions and she's like, should I be a mother? And it says yes or no. And so that's like one structuring principle that she uses. But what I realize and what I love so much about fiction is like, there's no proof that Sheila is actually flipping a coin. She could just be writing this and having
Yeah,
fun with the answers, but the
yeah.
reader is kind of believing that what she's doing is flipping the coin and that's what's being told to her, and it kind of tells a narrative that way. But I'm like,
Oh,
well,
uh-huh.
knowing Sheila is like I bet she's like fucking with the reader a little bit maybe, but
Yeah,
like
yeah.
but it's still fun because she's sticking to that kind of rule or that paradigm. So that's just one example that you made me think of. But in terms of like how you view your art, there's a quote that I love from the book, and it's, I believe an artist should never put too much intention or meaning into their work, lest it render it stupid or worse, merely dry. And I'm wondering if that is something that you personally believe, or kind of how you view like the seriousness of writing versus just kind of having fun and seeing what comes out of it.
Well, what I don't like, what I see happening in a lot of contemporary fiction is where um people are putting like a lot of like intention in like sort of like political, like they're like setting things up where like these are the good people, these are the bad people. I think a writer named Rebecca Rothfeld wrote an essay called like sanctimony literature, and she's sort of using like Sally Rooney uh, and Ben Lerner as examples of it, where it's very clear in some of their novels who like the people she has or the writer has sort of disdain for, you know, and like these are the good people, these are like the good, you know, liberal people, and these are the bad conservative people or whatever it is. And what I really want to do is, you know, like a lot of my characters are absurd, but that's just because they're absurd. I'm still trying to treat them with like tenderness, and I don't have like disdain for any of my characters. Like even like James, the cult leader, like I'm like I try and treat him very tenderly. Danny, who's like the son of a billionaire hedge fund manager, like I don't have disdain for any of my characters, and like I want to treat them fairly and give them you know, whatever, you know, their behavior might be bad, but me as the author is I'm not going to like impose any like value judgments on them. And when I read stuff that is it's just so clear what the author's point of view is on a subject, and it takes me out of the story sometimes. um and then the other part of that, I guess, is just in terms of just laboring over something for too long. Like I can tell when like a book has been labored over for too long. Just like when people say they worked on a book for like 5 years or longer than that, I'm just like, you're not even the same person who is like writing this book throughout. Like I feel like for me, like a piece of art should be like you're capturing a place and a time, a moment, and like so I try and write quickly, like, and I think that gives the book a lot of its momentum and it's like coherence in a way, and like maybe it's a little bit like rougher in places, like you know, like I sometimes I think my pacing is a little not the best, like the strongest you know, strongest part of my books, but I think the momentum and the urgency of it is more important. And so I guess to the quote, that is like something I think about a lot. I'm just like when I hear about people just like laboring over the same thing for so long, I'm just like, yeah, the fire has probably gone out, and like you're just polishing something to death. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean that's something I'm always curious about in terms of like when writers know or feel that their book is done or when they want to keep,
Yeah.
continue working on it. And this book, kind of speaking to the pacing of it and how what you're saying, I think is replicated in just the form of it is there's, I think, over like 50 chapters, and they kind of read to me like flash fiction sometimes, or like kind of contain
Yeah.
short stories that all
Yeah.
kind of speak to each other.
Yeah.
Is that something that you intended to do, or is that kind of just a product of you kind of trying to get all your ideas out, in
Yeah.
that form?
Yeah. Like I never know where anything is going. Like there's no, you know, I sat down on day one and wrote the first chapter and I go, well, okay. And when I wrote it, I treated it like a job, basically. Like I sat in the chair from like 9 a.m. till noon every day, tried to write like 1,000 words. And then in the afternoon, I would come back and edit it. And then that afternoon, I would like try and just come up with like something, like an idea for the next day. So like when I sat down, I at least had something to go on, but there's no outlining or anything. And there's no, I barely, you know, sometimes I would know like what would happen like or a day or two in advance. But I think with this book, there's a lot of sort of like world building, getting to know Paul and his world, because it is kind of like like you were saying, it's like it's not the world that everyone knows, right? It's not the realist world. So I had to really set this foundation of like who the hell this guy is and in the world that he's operating in. And then sort of later in the book, I'm like, oh damn, like I probably need to like have some plot in here. And like it's a literary fiction novel, so it's, you know, it's not a mystery or a thriller or a genre that's really heavily dependent on plot. Like it's more of an interior novel. It's kind of a psychological novel. So the main thing you're getting out of it is like what people are invested in is Paul's brain, basically, you know. It's not like any plot. But you know, like the last 100 pages, there's like a lot of plot, right? Because I was like, oh, okay, I figured out the world. Like, let's give the people some story here now. Yeah.
Yeah, and that kind of makes me want to ask you about, I know you mentioned character already and how attempt to, treat them fairly. And I'm wondering how you view character as like, as a tool in your writing. Like when you're imposing certain ideas. So I already asked you about your thoughts on something that a character believes, which I don't know how I feel about doing that, but it was just in the book, so I thought I would. But I mean, like in terms of how you use character as a tool to kind of impose critical or like your thoughts about art or high fashion, or kind of how the book is commenting on these things indirectly
Yeah.
with with Paul's mind. Like, how do you view character as a way of doing that indirectly or directly, if you might see it that way too?
Yeah. I mean, I don't think um like any of my beliefs are necessarily like Paul's beliefs. I think a lot of times what I always do is take my beliefs and then I'm like, what's the inverse of that? That's what Paul will believe, you know? And I think for like everything, it was always just trying to find something very novel, like a way of seeing things that is very novel and doesn't necessarily have anything to do with the way I think. A lot of times I'll like pick the other characters around him and like push back on Paul's ideas um, through the other characters, and maybe I'm more in line with some of the other characters who are like sort of questioning Paul's beliefs and his worldview. Um, but like I think ultimately like I'm looking for the most entertaining thing, kind of. Like uh, at the end of the day, when I'm writing it, like I'm hoping that someday there will be an audience for the work, but mainly like I'm trying to write the book that like I would want to read, I think. And so, and I do think at like some point, like that sometimes it's like out of my hands a little bit. Like I do kind of feel like there's a bit of alchemy in the writing process. Like there's some like divine intervention. Like when I'm reading over the work, sometimes I'm like, oh, this is like much better than like what I'm actually like capable of. Like where the hell did this come from? This is like beyond the limits of my of my talent. And when I like look over things and then I like read past books, I'm like, wow, that's pretty clever. It's good. Like I see other things that are a little cringy and I'm critical of, but um, I think there's just something in the art, the act of like writing that happens, and I'm not always super deliberate, and it's like not always super intentional. Things just happen, and you don't really know where it came from, and I don't necessarily have a good explanation for why certain things happen. But when they happen, you know it's right, and just thank you just yeah you just thankful that it came.
Yeah, I mean that's something that fascinates me so much, and one reason why I wanted to do this podcast is because I think there's an interesting like dynamic between learning about how a writer kind of comes up with their plot or their narrative or their ideas and how they put it into a written form, right? And how sometimes I've had a couple of authors now mention that like sometimes they don't know like why something came up or how it did, but they
Yeah,
knew that's where it should have went.
yeah,
And that's fascinating to me. It's almost like there's something magical. Like how can that be? Like where does it
yeah,
come from and how do you kind of put it into that form? But then separately, like how does that translate to Jalen in my room reading the book and the experiences that I bring to the page? And then when
yeah,
we both come here together, it's like what are we creating now about this? Like that's just very meta and annoying probably to say it that way. But it's something that I think is interesting and like how we kind of consume art. And I think this book is trying to consider those questions in the form of the novel itself. And it's really
yeah,
fun to read when you then like bounce that off of like kind of slapstick, just like crazy shit that happens in the book that
yeah,
is just funny to read and it gives it that propulsion as well, while
yeah,
also containing the whole plot. So I think your comment about pacing, I mean, I think the way that you add those slapstick elements, even when it's kind of a contained part of the book, really helps the reader want to keep going to see like where is he gonna go next with this? But
something you just said about like that I was like conscious of. One thing I was sort of conscious of in the writing it, and you were talking about like as a reader versus like the writer, and Paul's making art throughout the book, and and as the reader, you're seeing like the actual work that he's making, and you're getting people's opinions of it, and like as the right reader, you don't know if this guy's a genius or if he's an idiot. You don't know if his art is good. It's very inscrutable. Like some people, depending on who's looking, it's either brilliant or horrible, and he gets both of those reactions throughout his book. And he's not even always like, he's not like the best. He's not, certainly not objective about his own work. And for me, it's interesting. Like when I read over over the book, I'm not conscious of like the themes necessarily as I'm writing them, but then when I read after I'm done and I'm looking back over everything, I see, oh, okay, yeah, these are the themes that I was exploring and this and that. But then when people read the book, they'll come to me and they'll say, oh, this is what I got out of it. And I go, oh, what? And sometimes somebody will like really surprise me and like tell me something that's like way beyond what I had ever considered. But then after they sort of explain what they got out of it, it makes total sense. And I'm like, yeah, maybe my subconscious was trying to do that. Like, I hope so. Like, that's great. Yeah. And I actually explored that tension a little bit with one of the things in the book where Paul makes this painting of like three birds and he paints two of them and leaves one of them unpainted. And then Danny gives him all these, or maybe it was James, or no, I don't remember. One of the other characters like gives all these like ideas about the painting. And then like this other character calls bullshit on it, and then later he's like having this like psychic meltdown about it, because he doesn't know what the hell he was doing. It's just what happened, right? The art just happened, and so it's interesting to get other people's like takes on things for sure. I'm very interested in it, and sometimes the takes are garbage, and it's like they just misread things or whatever. But other times you get really savvy readers who can shine some light on something that you never even considered.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's why I think I'm drawn to conversation, especially with, the writers that make the books that I talk about on this podcast, just because like I kind of use it as on the one hand, like a test for myself to see like whether my reading of a book aligned whatsoever with like what the writer was trying to do, or kind of what can kind of come
Yeah.
out of that conversation. But there's also, I think, something to be said. It's interesting how like maybe for like the readers that might not get Paul, for example, like they might be out there and like that is still an experience that is like that happens and I guess is like valid, so to speak, of like a
Yeah.
read of it, which might
My
be a
my
hard.
my mom read the book like in manuscript form, and I told her, my mom was like, she wants me, she's like, why can't you write a book like XYZ, like her favorite authors that are all very, very, commercially successful. Mom, it's not that easy. Like, like whatever. My books are a little bit like eccentric for that. And like, but I think this book has some commercial appeal. And then she read the book. Well, she started the book. She read like 50 pages. And then she comes to me and she's like basically almost crying. And she's like, Matt, who do you think would ever want to read this book?
Oh my
Like
God.
she didn't get it at all. And then she was a little bit like heartbroken because she knew I like worked on the book for a long time and it was like important to me. But she didn't get the book at all. Like she doesn't get absurdism, she like looks at everything like very, very literally. So she had trouble with absurdism. And I think also she was worried that I was Paul. Like
Mm.
she was that like very much upset her. And then she read the book again shortly. Like my mom actually passed away a few months ago. So she read it like on her deathbed. And I think she was able to like better read it with like more objectively, having read it once and then talk to me about it and like get back in it. Cause like I definitely borrow some things from like my real life, just like all writers do. And as like a reader who doesn't know me, you would never know that. But like whenever you're like reading someone who very, very well, you could see like the little like bits of them in the book that they're borrowing, and it's not necessarily them, but they're fictionalizing like little things from their life, their own experiences. But yeah, I definitely expected a lot of people would not get this book. Like my mom didn't at first, but so far the responses that at least that I've been received in writing in the form of reviews, like 5 minutes before we got on this call, like I got a review at Volume 1 Brooklyn, and I was like, should I read it? Is it good? If it's bad, am I going to be depressed going into my conversation with you? But it was like super glowing, and the person like totally got it, and I was like, great, yeah. And not that like people's opinion of the work matters to me that much, because I kind of know what I set out to do, and I know I did executed what I was trying to do ultimately. Like I'm happy with the work, and I know that like some people are going to really like it and some people are not going to get it. I'm just happy that like more people are getting it than I anticipated.
Yeah, I'm wondering how that experience is maybe translated to this book and putting out a book now. I mean, I heard another podcast about, and you mentioned this briefly earlier too, about like your kind of pattern of working in the writing a novel, or kind
Yeah.
of just your relationship to working on novels, as a career versus, or yeah, just making money from art, and how you're just feeling right now putting this book out. And yeah, just like generally how you feel about doing press and stuff. Like I feel like it must be. I'm always curious because like I'm playing a role in that, like doing a
Yeah.
podcast with you, but just how it feels to have a book out now. Like, does it feel different from your first book or kind of similar?
I feel like I'm a little bit more like not like I see some like you've had some massive writers on your show. And it's like I'm like, oh great, like he's talked to like Franzen and Otessa and Catherine Lacey. Like those are some serious people. And all of those people have basically made writing their whole livelihood, right? Like they either are just writing like Franzen and making a great living off of that, or they're writing and probably teaching writing somewhere, like at a university, like Otessa or I think Catherine Lacey teaches too. And I never had like aspirations to be a writer. Like I played in bands in my 20s, and then I got like my first like real job when I was probably like 27, 28, because I just wasn't making enough money as a musician, and I didn't want to bartend and do that kind of thing anymore. Um, and so throughout like the last decade, I've always had like a day job that's like kind of a serious day job. It's like, and it's like right now I develop solar projects for a living, and I sort of worked in renewable energy for a number of years. But I can't actually ever write and work at the same time, because I just can't like serve two masters that way. Like my day job, where I'm just like doing like financial modeling and talking to like private equity guys and like lawyers all day, like just kills the creative impulse. So basically, what I do is like I write or I work for a couple of years, save up some money, quit or get fired in the case of this last book, and then like write for like a year and do the book. I would love to be able to like make a living, but I don't really like have any like delusions of grandeur that like one of my books will be like a big hit. I just want to write the best books I can, and I think I'm pretty happy with the way this book came out. Like I think it's as good as I can do, and I think it holds its weight against like my contemporaries like pretty well. Yeah, if I could in the future like be able to like not talk to private equity guys and lawyers all day for a living, and just write, that would be great. I don't know how many books I have in me. Like I don't. Some people have like a million great ideas. Like I was listening to you talk to Otessa and then a couple other people, and like some of these people have like multiple projects that they're working on at the same time. Like I have like one. I don't actually even have any ideas until I sit down and like start working. Like the ideas come to me as I'm working. Like I never have any ideas in advance. So um maybe I need like having a day job just to like fill the time until I can write again. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's something that I don't know. It's hard for me to think about because like as you mentioned, like I've had, some of my favorite writers who are, very successful in that regard. But it also seems kind of like I guess what am I trying to say? It frustrates me personally as a reader that one, I only have so much time to like read like
Yeah.
books, and how many, pieces of art that I might be missing out on that aren't published at like a big publisher, or not getting, huge marketing budgets to be everywhere. And then everyone ends
Yeah.
up reading and has an opinion about it versus maybe a book like on an indie press or something. And so I don't know, like, I don't know what my question is. It just kind of frustrates me. And just the time that we have to like consume art, and like how much art is being made, and how
Yeah.
much good shit might be out there that we might not like know
Yeah. Yeah.
about. Like that
Yeah.
frustrates me as a reader. I don't know if you have a similar feeling about that, but
Yeah. And also like at least with like contemporary fiction, I don't read that much contemporary fiction, but I think over like the last year and a half, I've made more of like an attempt to like just see what other people sort of in like my cohort of like young writers are doing. And I don't necessarily like I think like having people like you like do like gatekeepers sort of are doing a good job. I don't think like the big publishing industry as a whole is necessarily doing a good job getting like the best work out. Like I think like uh the novel has become like whatever, it's a business, I get it. And like the main, most of the books being purchased are not literary fiction. It's beach reads for my mom's book club, that are people move through very quickly. But I don't really think of that as art. I just think of that as like a commodity. And most of the books that I've read are like that I really love. Like I just read this book called Cheap Therapist Says You're Insane by this guy like named Parker Young. And I think it's like the sharpest thing I've read in forever. And it came out on a really small press called Future Tense. And like, it's probably sold 50 books. And I'm like, how is this not the biggest book in the world? Like this guy's so genius. And then I like see some of the books that are like the big bestsellers and I like open them and I'm like what? Like it just either is like I just don't get it. So I don't really know like how the publishing industry works, and I guess I'm not like the target demographic and like of like who they're trying to sell books to. But yeah, there's like you were saying, there's so much good work out there. I just don't always know where to like find it, and like it is good. Like like I think I like originally heard of Catherine Lacey years ago, and she was her partner Jesse Ball at the time. Like I had become a huge fan of his, and then found her work through that. So I think mainly the way I find work is I'll find someone that whose work I really love, and then see what they like. I think that's kind of how I got into writing. Like I was like, I'd always been a musician, and I was like, all right, I'm going to try writing. I need to read a ton. So what I would do is like I would go to like the Paris Review interviews, uh, find an interview that like really blew me away, read that person's work, and then find out what influenced them, and then read that person's work and that person's work. And that's basically where my reading came from, was just getting these like recommendations from the masters. But yeah, there's a lot of good stuff out there.
Yeah, I mean, I feel the same exact way. I mean, this kind of sets up perfectly like my last question for every interview, which is just for book recommendations. But I tend to find I have the same experience. Like I try to curate my own shelves and what I pick up just based on this podcast. And then I rely like heavily on blurbs of like if I see a writer that I love has blurbed something that makes me more likely to pick it up or what have you. But I use writers as like the number one like influencing tool for myself. And it's kind of
Yeah,
led me to like the best stuff that I've read.
yeah,
But for you, I mean, what have you been reading lately? Do you have like any other like recommendations that you would give today?
yeah. I mean, in terms of like contemporary fiction, like you and me were talking offline about Ali Rowbottom's book Aesthetica, that came out last year. Her husband John Lindsay wrote a book called Body High, which is just so good, so poignant, so tender. Um, so I mean, yeah, it's just really brilliant. I have a friend named D Foy, who is kind of like a mentor to me, and I think he's like just really brilliant. Who else am I missing? Contemporary. Yeah, there's a lot out there that's really good. Now I'm drawing a blank, of course, as soon as I get off this call, I'll be like, why didn't you say this person? Why didn't you say this person? Sort of like my favorites of all time are like a guy named Emmanuel Bove, who's like a French writer that like Colette sort of discovered in like maybe like the 1920s. Like my sensibilities, I think, were very influenced by him. Newt Hampson, like I was very influenced by him. Um, a book that like really made a mark on me when I first started writing was Jane Bowles' book, Two Serious Ladies. Like, like I read Paul Bowles because everyone talked about Paul Bowles, but then I read, like I loved Paul Bowles, but like somewhere along the line, I realized he had this wife, Jane Bowles, who wrote this one novel, and it's like the most irreverent. It's from like the 1950s, I think, and it's just so brilliant. And I learned like, oh, you can like you can write like this, like you can be like irreverent. It doesn't everything doesn't have to be like super serious and like there's like a playfulness to it and just like this like humor. Um, yeah, there's a few for you.
Yeah, I picked up the I haven't read it yet, but I have the Jane Bowles book. It's in like Sheila Heti, as I previously mentioned, like her top five books. I've looked up her like top 10 favorite books or whatever online, and
Oh yeah.
that was like number two or something. So
Oh really? Yeah. It
yeah,
makes sense. It's such a good book. Jane Bowles is like it's such a shame. Like she only wrote the one novel,
that's okay.
and
Yeah.
I think she had like some mental health problems that prevented her from like ever being able to put together another book. But damn, if you're only gonna write one book, that's a good one to have written.
Yeah, I'll have to prioritize that because I feel like, doing this and trying to get this podcast to be, something not big. What am I trying to say? I don't know. Something substantial, I guess. It's
Yeah,
been reading
which
a
it
lot of
is. Yeah, yeah,
like newer books, and I'm pissed because whenever I pick up something backlist, like I tend to love it and want to keep reading it, but then I always end up like getting pulled into new releases, and it's annoying. So I'm making it a goal for myself, like the rest of this year into next, to try to prioritize at least like half of my reading be like stuff that I just am interested in. Like if I see it at a library and
yeah,
it sounds cool, just read it instead of like trying to,
yeah,
find reviews of it or see if is it worthwhile to read. If it sounds
yeah,
interesting, just like do it. But
yeah.
I don't know. It's frustrating for me
Yeah.
personally.
One of my favorite books. This guy named uh one one of my favorite. I was in Kansas City once, and I was about to like go to the airport, and I walked past this like bookstore, used bookstore, and they had like this like shelf of books outside that were like $1 each. And so I just like grabbed, like looked through them. It was mainly like cookbooks and stuff like that. And like I found this one book, and it was called like Pluche. And it was a French book from like the 1950s in translation by this the writer. His name is Jean Dutoit. Jean Dutoit, yeah, I think that's it. And whatever. So I was like, great, I'll take this on the plane. And I was just like obsessed. And then I've read all his books now that are in translation. And I mean, he's not read anymore. Like one of his books, I think I had to pay like $90 to get it in translation because it was like the only copy in existence in English. And but it was just dumb luck. And like I've asked like a couple of my French friends who are like in the literary world in France, I was like, have you heard of this person? And they're like, no, like he's not a thing. And I'm just like, but it was just dumb luck that I just picked this book off the shelf, and he sort of transformed my writing life a little bit in a way for sure.
This is like, so this is not an unknown author, I realize. But have you read, just speaking of French literature, which I've been having kind of a moment with lately? I read Whatever by Ulbeck.
But
And now that you're like talking about this, and I'm thinking about it right now. So forgive me for not being eloquent in this comparison, but I kind of feel like there's some similarities between Whatever and Pure Cosmos Club a little bit, just like
yeah,
in terms of tone and just kind of how it plays with.
yeah,
I mean, Whatever's like an incredibly like depraved and fucked book and
yeah.
in many regards, and this
Well,
is like less so, but yeah.
yeah, no, Welbeck's one of my favorite writers, and funny that like you said that. Um, Annika Levy, who runs Forever magazine, she like blurbed the book and said, "It's like Welbeck, but good natured." That's like her blurb. Yeah,
Oh
yeah,
my God, that's interesting. Yeah, yeah, I mean, it does. I don't know. Like that's the only book I've read by him. But that was just another example of like a random book that I picked up that I loved that it makes me want to read more.
yeah. Oh
Yeah,
yeah. I
French.
mean, if you like that one at all, I've read all his work. That's like his starter novel. But like, if the next one you should read is probably Elementary Particles,
Okay.
which is probably, I mean, all his books have like great qualities to them. But like that one is so masterful. I think that one's probably the one that's like the most masterfully done. Another book called Possibility of an Island, which is like very like it's kind of got like a science fiction element, and that's like his most ambitious book, I think. And then he wrote a controversial book called Submission, um, about sort of like a Muslim takeover of France, like where this like Muslim Brotherhood guy becomes president, and they sort of he imposes like a soft Sharia law, and it's very interesting. It was a very controversial book in France, obviously, but the book is just so well done. Yeah, he's a genius.
I gotta, so I picked up, I only have two books of his like on my shelf. I got the Elementary Particle, so I'm glad that you said that's a good next one. But Yeah, thank you so much for coming on, Matthew. I think this book is so fun. I want to get it into more, readers' hands to talk about it with more people and stuff. It's so fun. I say this all the time, but it really blows my mind having like being able to do this, talk to writers, and
Yeah.
it's the most fun thing I do. Everything in the world to do. So I'm just thankful that you've been a part of it. And yeah, thank you.
Well, no, yeah, and thank you very much. This came out like on a small indie press, and like, obviously, like you have access to like these like very big writers. So the fact that you chosen to like shine a light on my book, it really means a lot to me. So I really appreciate that. Yeah, it's a big deal to me. So thank you very much.